So we are taking a break from our double legendary combo series, with range DPS being the last one left, to go over what's going on this week. Between the new week with the new affixes of Mythic Plus, a few cool things I want to share about the raid, and then the new things of the reset. Particularly, the more important thing this week is that you have Nagia and Nia, two of the Soulbinds for Ventir and Nightfey, that are going to give you your last potency conduit. Particularly Nia, the strongest of the Soulbinds for Nightfey. Nia, pretty much because of her growth invigoration, before even her eventual super powerful and should be nerfed passive ability, Nia's Tools Burst, which is going to be one of the strongest passives you can use, giving over 4% DPS buff to all the specs using Nightfey. Unfortunately, the specs using Nightfey are specs like Fire Mage, specs like Balance Druid, specs like Marksmanship Hunter, so not exactly some poor, non-meta, hipster niche specs, but some already very powerful specs are going to be able to gain this advantage. When it comes to the conduit though, having an extra potency conduit of the spec that are the most played in those Soulbinds, in those Covenants, you have pretty much Warrior for Ventir, because of Condemn, at the very least in raids. Unfortunately, for Warrior, not too good. Warrior doesn't have very powerful conduits outside of their first one, their main one. Fury, both Depths of Insanity or Vicious Contempt for AoE or single target, and Arms Warrior, Mortal Combo, we are talking less than 2% damage, even closer to 1%, so it's very minor. Whereas for Nightfey, Balanced Druid of course is very powerful because of Convoke. For Nightfey they do not have though a very powerful second conduit. Fury of the Skies is their second best, which they will likely use. It's a little bit over 2% of their DPS. So Marksmanship doesn't have a particularly strong single target conduit that they can use as a second one. Sharpshooter's focus is pretty poor, again around 1.5% of their damage. However, Marksmanship has just one very powerful conduit that they use, which is Spirit Attunement, because of their Wild Spirit effectiveness. But after Spirit Attunement, they don't really have a single target or AoE big advantage they can gain from a second conduit. It's still, again, around the 2% gain. The actual change, the actual pretty good buff is going to be for Fire Mage, because in both single target and AoE, they have a pretty good conduit they can use. Discipline of the Grove, which can also be used in AoE, is going to give you even more cooldown reduction to your main abilities. And then specifically for AoE, you have Master Flame for even more Flame Strike damage. Both of those are closer to 4% of your DPS, which is pretty significant from a single conduit. So unfortunately, this is another week where Nightfey gets the strongest Soulbind. Nightfey gets some pretty powerful buffs to the specs playing this Covenant, and the specs playing this Covenant are already pretty popular themselves. Meanwhile, Warrior, whatever, poor guy. The other thing happening this week is, of course, that we are done with the campaign. We are done with the chain quest for Torghast, so there is not going to be any more quests in Torghast, there's not going to be any more quests for your campaign, so you're just down to 2 renown per week. So it's a much more quiet week. This is pretty much the start of the downward trend of the release of the expansion until we wait for the next patch, the next content patch. Basically, we are entering the autopilot mode for the expansion until we get more content. Now, talking about the content, we have to talk about this week of Mythic Plus. Now, yes, of course, it's Spiteful again. I'm sure melee DPS are going to be thrilled by this affix. However, you have to be the martyrs this week. You have to look for the greater good of the party. Spiteful is very cool. It's just going to be bad for you, but the tank is not going to care. The healer and range are going to be 20 to 30 yards away, so it's going to be all you this week, because this is a very good week. It's a very easy week. Volcanic is, of course, fully dodgeable, technically and theoretically. 0 damage, 0 extra effort from your party to deal with this affix. Nowhere near things like Necrotic, nowhere near things like even something like Grievous or something like Sanguine in terms of time wasted, with things like kiting, with things like repositioning the pack. Very, very easy affix. Yes, Spiteful is going to be more annoying. There is no other way around it. I said I don't like the way it works because it's basically just made to annoy melee. I mentioned a good fix for Spiteful should be that the dying mob should just shoot up in the air a shadow orb that is going to land somewhere random around the party and then start chasing a party member. This way, Spiteful can work on both melee and range at the same level equally. Whereas, as long as it's worked like this, it's going to be pretty annoying for melee. pretty detrimental to invite melee DPS to your keys, unfortunately. So living in a world with no melee DPS in your group, this is an amazing week. When we look at the dungeons and we use the same method as the previous weeks, you have to start looking, first of all, at the base difficulty of the dungeon. There is no amount of difficult affixes that are going to make Mists or Halls of Atonement much harder than something like Necrotic Wake, for example. But the other thing you have to keep an eye out is going to be on the density and the space. So how much are these affixes going to impact these dungeons? And unfortunately, it's going to be the same thing as the previous weeks, where the worst one of both worlds is going to go to Sanguine Depths. Because even though Volcanic doesn't really affect either, space or density of mobs doesn't matter to Volcanic, just dodge, forehead. The only difference is going to be Spiteful. Cramped, narrow corridors are going to be more annoying for Spiteful than any other zone. You know, imagine the wide, circular rooms of your maze in Mists of Ternaseeth. It's much easier to kite a Spiteful bunch of mobs. Even the much wider room of Plagueful is going to be pretty easy and comfortable to dodge Spiteful, but Sanguine Depths is a corridor. So you either get your party to all kite back and take them down, or you get your party to run forward and CC them as they get stuck there. You don't have many other options. So when we look at the dungeons as a whole, of course, Mists of Ternaseeth and Halls of Atonement are still easier, not because of the affixes, not because of the combo of affixes, but because they are just undertuned dungeons. Not only that, but if we really want to look at it, Halls of Atonement is going to be harder in Tyrannical than it is in Fortified, so this week is like even easier. On the second level, you can put the other side, Theater of Pain and Plagueful. This is because, like last week, there is going to be a big bunch of dungeons in the middle. The other side, Theater of Pain, Plagueful, and Spires, which are going to change in difficulty based on the primary affix, Fortified or Tyrannical. And this week, since it's Fortified, it means the Tyrannical-based dungeons, like Plagueful, like Theater of Pain, and like the other side, become easier. Meanwhile, the Fortified-based dungeons on a Fortified week become harder, so Necrotic Wake and Spires of Ascension become more difficult. Of course, one could argue that there is no week for Necrotic Wake. Whether it is Tyrannical or Fortified, it's still going to be annoying and difficult, so that could actually also be true. But yes, apart from the oddity of Necrotic Wake, Plagueful is of course, after several nerfs to their trash mobs and pretty much untouched, tough Tyrannical bosses like Domina and Stradama, Fortified Week makes it much easier. Theater of Pain, of course, is a Tyrannical-focused dungeon due to the higher than normal amount of bosses you have to go through, and the last boss also being pretty tough. Gorechop as well can be pretty tough on Tyrannical. After the, I guess, hotfix of Kultarok giving you guaranteed double hands on the ground, it's not going to be that difficult on Tyrannical, but it is still tougher than dealing with Fortified mobs in Theater of Pain. Theater of Pain, unlike Mists and Halls of Atonement, can become harder on Fortified given certain affixes. This week though, definitely not that week. The only caveat for this easiness of these dungeons is going to be the other side, because while being easier on Fortified, while being much more challenging on Tyrannical, the Arden Wheel Zone on Fortified with Spiteful, when you have to kill about 74,000 mobs in that zone, can be pretty annoying. Particularly with the first part of the zone, where you ideally want to go down the road and not try to pull too much. When you have a ton of Spitefuls, it's going to be pretty annoying, but certainly not as annoying as Necrotic Wake and Spires of Ascension, so it stays a tier above. And then towards the bottom, Spires of Ascension is the opposite of something like Plagueful. Spires of Ascension is the Fortified difficult dungeon, not Tyrannical, even though the mobs, many of the trash of Spires of Ascension has been nerfed. It is still pretty tough on the bigger pulls. And then at the very bottom, you have Necrotic Wake and Sanguine Depths. I still think Necrotic Wake is more doable and easier than Sanguine Depths, mostly because Necrotic Wake is not going to get as many tough affixes as Sanguine Depths. Things like Sanguine, things like Quaking, and even Spiteful this week are not as annoying in Necrotic Wake than they are in Sanguine Depths. So this is your week, pretty much the same at the top and at the bottom, with the only change being the Fortified focused dungeons become harder and the Tyrannical focused dungeons become easier. Now, with the Mythic Plus part done, we will go and look again at Mythic Plus around Sunday, maybe Monday, to see how the week has gone, if there has been some changes in the popularity of specs and whatnot. But for now, we have to look at some cool things that are going on in the raid. They are cool because they interested me, so you have to find them cool yourself, otherwise we'll have to have a chat. Now, here is what's going on right now in the raid. So, a little tip. if you're trying to progress in a raid, if you're looking at the bosses, you know, which ones are going to be the harder ones, tougher to progress. First of all, no, the bosses later on are not going to be necessarily harder. It's not going to be boss 1 is difficult 1, and then boss 5 is difficult 5, and boss 10 is difficult 10. It's not always like that. But number 2, a quick way to see just how difficult the bosses are and how tough they're going to be to progress on. So maybe as a raider, or even as an officer or raid leader or whatnot, you want to pay more attention to how to prepare for that specific boss. It can tell you a few things. For example, when you look at the progress on Mythic Castonatria, the progress seems nice and fluid up until we get to Lady Inerva. The order here is a little bit jumbled because you can go to whichever boss after the first 3, but after you go to Shriekwing and then Altimore, then you get Destroyer, you get Sun King Salvation, then you get Zymox, and then you get Inerva. So the progress skills here are pretty smooth, expected, and normal. The first big jump, which is going to tell you about the first block of the progression, is going to be Council of Blood. You can see that out of the 969 guilds that kill Zymox, 856 killed Inerva. So Inerva gets killed very quickly after killing Zymox, so it's not too difficult whatsoever. It has a very high kill rate. Compare this to Council of Blood. 856 guilds kill Inerva and 342 kill Council of Blood. It's a major block. For most guilds, this is going to take at least 2 weeks, probably 3, to get through Council of Blood. That's, for example, an easy way of telling how much more difficult a boss is. And with this piece of information, I decided to make a nice comparison. When you go back to Uldir, to 2 years ago, Castonatria is still progressing at roughly a third of the pace of Uldir in terms of kills. But the real interesting part is that the last 3 bosses of Uldir, comparing them to Sludgefist, Stone Legion, and Denathrius. When you look at Uldir, at this exact same point in time, roughly 35 days after the release of Mythic, Zul had 610 kills, Mithrax had 279, and Gahun had 116. So again, you see it's a gradual decrease of kills. You have 610, which becomes 279, which is less than half, and then 279 becomes 116, which is less than half, slightly. It's actually 45% to 41% amount of kills. So 45% of the kills that kill Zul were able to kill Mithrax, and then 41% of the kills that kill Mithrax were able to kill Gahun. It's actually pretty quick. Compare this to the current situation in Castonatria, because the current situation in Castonatria is 171 guilds killed Sludgefist, 52 killed Stone Legion Generals, and 39 killed Denathrius. Quick maths, this means that 30% of the guilds that kill Sludgefist have killed Stone Legion, and 75% of the guilds that cleared Stone Legion killed Denathrius. This is a switch of epic proportions. If you remember, all the way back to 4 years ago, over 4 years ago, during Legion Emerald Nightmare, the difference in difficulty between Il'gynoth into Cenarius into Xavius. People took 2 weeks to kill Il'gynoth, 3 weeks or more to kill Cenarius, and then 1 day to kill Xavius, which was supposed to be the last boss. This is something not quite as drastic, because Xavius as a last boss was really a meme, but it is still telling that in Uldir you went from 45% to 41%, so roughly similar, slight decrease, and here you're going from 30 to 75. So what this is telling you is that Sludgefist is rather difficult, Stone Legion is very difficult, and Denathrius is, comparatively speaking, very easy. Now, we heard about this. If you followed the World First Race, a few of the interviews mentioned by a few players from both Limit and even Echo that Denathrius was an easy fight as a last boss. As guilds that just went through Sludgefist and went through Stone Legion, Denathrius, cool fight, very enjoyable, but easy. They took less wipes, they took less attempts, but back then we only had 1 world kill on Denathrius, 2, 3, so it was difficult to make a comparison. Now though, we have had a month. We had way more kills, we had dozens of kills, and we can actually start to see the difference, to see what they meant when they said that, because this easiness of Denathrius is being reflected in the amount of kills. Also interesting that since then, when we're talking about raids, Blizzard hasn't really applied any more changes, any more buffs or nerfs to bosses whatsoever. Now, in previous expansions and previous tiers, Blizzard usually waited the end of the World First Race to add a few changes, and then waited again for the end of the Hall of Fame race. Now, considering Castonatria is going at 1/3 of the pace of a lot of previous tiers, this could take a while to go without nerfs. And more importantly, remember that last expansions you also used to get more gear. So your version of getting the bosses nerfed was Titan Forging, was higher amount of loot from Mythic Plus, higher amount of loot from raids. This time you don't even have that. So you don't have the bosses being nerfed, and you don't have a shower of loot. It's not gonna be as easy to catch up on these boss kills or to maybe change the difficulty of these bosses, because you won't get more loot, at least for now. We have to wait on the next patch if Blizzard changes something, and so far we're not getting any balance changes. So I thought this was interesting to highlight the current biggest block of the raid being Council of Blood, as well as the harder difficulty of both Sludgefist and Stone Legion compared to the Natrius. And now, after this essential piece of information, which I'm sure has made you all better players, we can call it quits for the day. Tomorrow, we're going to have, you guessed it, another video. Who knows what it's gonna be? You'll have to wait, I guess, roughly 24 hours, and then you will see. So, see you guys soon, and in the meantime, Xavius was really embarrassing.